Welcome to Extra Takes, hosted by Northland Church Lead Pastor Dr. Joshua Laxton. Join us each week as Pastor Josh reveals the rest of the story behind his sermons. We'll discuss how those who follow Christ can live out a biblical vision for the church in our world today.
Well, hello, Northland family and friends. Welcome to another episode of Extra Takes. I'm PJ digitally alongside Matt Shiles, my co-host, because I am in Wheaton, Illinois. I'm back here for a week-long leadership intensive that I am teaching. So I'm teaching organizational and change leadership at the graduate level. And so, hey, it is very fitting that I'm here this week, given this past weekend of looking at Acts 15 around more of a leadership lesson and life lesson. So, Matt, it's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. So this weekend, this was like in your wheelhouse, right? You got to talk about Bible and leadership. How about that?
And it's fun. And I got to actually share more of the devotional thought with the class that I'm teaching, and they ate it up. I mean, they were like, man, that was good. And so breaking it down, the way you look at Paul and Barnabas, and obviously, almost everybody can identify with John Mark. So yeah, it was a really fun message for me to preach, and obviously a very I say one that I resonated with deeply and in a way that was very vulnerable, I guess, with people. So yeah. I love the intersection between God's mission and leadership, and we got to see that this past weekend.
Yes. Yeah, I'm looking forward to near the end of our conversation, we will talk about that vulnerability, because that was definitely that stood out, and that was a highlight. So let's just dig in. So this weekend was called Empowered Band of Brothers, Become the Bands of Brothers. So it goes from one to multiple. So multiplying mission efforts through disagreements. Which is so fascinating, because we were all about church unity the last couple weeks, and now there's a sharp disagreement. So this is in Acts 15. So this is the third week we were in Acts 15, and this was the end of Acts 36 through 41, and this was March 2nd and 3rd. So you gave us two main points this time. The way you broke it down was one for Paul and Barnabas, and then one for John Mark. So this first one, sometimes God prompts leaders to split over sharp disagreements about strategy that multiplies mission efforts. So that's for Paul and Barnabas. And for John Mark, sometimes God allows for disappointments that develop us for later duties. So essentially the outline we had two, separate markers, one that talked about a leadership lesson, and then one that talked about a life lesson. And really the leadership lesson was focused on Paul and Barnabas, and then the life lesson was focused on John Mark. And what was so interesting about that is, I think for all of us, we can relate to either Paul or Barnabas, and then we can certainly all relate to John Mark. So in various aspects of our life, I think it allowed us to really be introspective about where we've been in our life, and how God can redeem and glorify even the devastating aspects of our life.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm looking forward to diving in. Let's start with this first point, the leadership lesson. I have a question here, because where I thought you were going was, I thought you were going to talk about, the crazy change of, we're talking about church unity, and all of a sudden we're talking about church disunity. And you said, no, that's not what's happening here. But there was a sharp disagreement. So how does that not affect church unity?
Well, so yeah, that's a really good question. And here's how I would explain it. So what we see, especially over the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at how they have really fought for the unity. And you remember the charts that I'd put up where it shows kind of like the splits of denominations throughout, kind of history. So I will say that, what we do see with Paul and Barnabas has been seen throughout church history in the church that has led to church splits. The thing that would break my heart, though, is instead of it leading to a church split where you went right down the street, maybe you were led to plant a church in an area that needed a church. Does that make sense? Because I do think that it is truly important for us to maintain Christian unity. But and that was even part of my answer is when do you split, right? Well, when there's no authority and no agreement, or when there is an authority and no agreement. So, and most church splits happen over there is an authority but no agreement. Okay, well, who's the authority? And then don't split, because part of the split is that you are graciously, or you're humbly submitting, or you're graciously withdrawing. And if you're graciously withdrawing, then you ain't going to go right down the street and create division and a split. Okay, so I understand that there throughout church history, such situations have happened, but it has led someone to go right down the street to plant a church, which shows more of a church division than anything else, rather than a missional kind of multiplication, right? Whereas if you're going to go with the kind of the heartbeat here in terms of what we see from a descriptive manner, you're not going to go down the street. You're going to go to the next city, or in some sense, maybe even the next state, or another region where the gospel isn't, or where the gospel is needed. Maybe that's a good kind of clarifying way of going. It is not a church split. Paul and Barnabas, I mean, they're not splitting churches, and one's going to, I'm going to go do this church. And no, they're splitting missional efforts. And I think that's really, really important to see.
Well, I also think it's helpful then the scripture that you pointed out at the end of Paul's life of how he commended John Mark, right? So I think when we look at kind of the fruit of the disagreement and the fruit of them parting ways, it did not result in the end in John Mark leaving ministry, or there being this bitterness towards the end between those two. But as you mentioned, there was a multiplication of mission efforts, which is just fascinating to just see how God really he can really move in that way. I mean, we know that, but it's so encouraging that in our weaknesses that he moves powerfully.
Yeah, well, and you think about, because you don't hear really about Barnabas again. Now, Paul's going to mention Barnabas by name in 1 Corinthians, so that's going to even be after what we see here. But we definitely see Paul, and Luke's going to continue to chart Paul, obviously, and Paul's going to write multiple books for the New Testament, or that will be part of the New Testament. So we know what he accomplishes. But you can just see, and that's the thing, you can just see from how he's wired as a leader, God using that gifting that he had placed on Paul's life to see this intense expansion of the church, where Barnabas is more of a developer. So you don't see a lot of multiplication, expansion under him. In fact, if my memory serves me correctly, when Barnabas goes back to Cyprus, I think that's his home. So so there's not because that's not how he's wired. He's not wired to expand. He's wired to develop. And I think it also shows us really an important part that you actually need both in the church. You need people who can expand. You need those intense people, but you also need those optimistic, caring people as well to be more coaching oriented around the development the development of the younger leaders. So, and I mean, so the fact that at least John Mark had Barnabas, that's awesome, because it could have crushed him, the fact that Paul did not want him, and he could have just given up on ministry altogether. And so I think this is really important, that when it comes to the church expanding mission, you actually need both Paul's and Barnabas's to see that happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's fascinating to think when we get that glimpse of Paul commending John Mark at the end, we know that Barnabas was such an encourager. We might not always think of it that way, but we can really commend Barnabas for having a role in John Mark's continued ministry.
Yeah.
Because like you said, without him, he may have been crushed. And that really gets us to our next point under the leadership lesson, and that's the personality tests. So this was fun, and a couple things I noticed. You and Paul were pretty similar.
I mean, well, obviously I projected myself onto Paul, because I see a lot of how I'm wired. I see that in the pages of Paul. I mean, he's an intense person. I mean, he comes sometimes across as angry. Like if you read his letters to the Corinthians, I mean, they're not a pleasant letter. I mean, and then like you read Galatians, like who said, like, and because I talked about a couple weeks ago of what he tells these Judaizers, what he tells them to do. I mean, he is a direct kind of person. He has high expectations. He's obviously, I don't want to say that, I don't want to read into the brilliancy of Paul and say, hey, I'm brilliant, but you just see this is the God's using him to expand, to grow, to truly be apostolic, and to go where the gospel hasn't been. And it requires a unique kind of leader to do that, right? And so yes, I wrote into, some of those more of an apostle Paul, like, Paul's not a 7 on the Enneagram. He's not an enthusiast. He's not going to be the life of the party. He's probably going to be a party pooper, so he's not a helper, so he's definitely not a peacemaker. I mean, he's going to cause some friction. So it's kind of easy in some of these personality profiles to kind of let, like DISC, you only have 4, Enneagram, you have 9. Now, the Myers-Briggs, you have a little bit more. In the Strength Finders, you have, even a lot more. So, so I try, and that's why I didn't, I gave him a couple of things from the Strength Finders, but definitely, dove into the DISC, the Myers-Briggs, and the Enneagram, which is 3 that I'm more familiar, with. So, yeah.
So fun fact, for the DISC and the Myers-Briggs, me and you are exact opposite.
Yeah. Oh, we are.
So you're a high D, I'm a CS, so I'm on like the other end, like from top to bottom.
Yeah.
And then for Myers-Briggs, I am ISFJ, which I think is all 4 the exact opposite.
Yeah. Well, and fascinating too. So, and then depending on how you're wired, will depend in some sense your pace. Just you live at a certain pace, right? And again, it's not like one's right, one's wrong. It's just how you're wired. But also one of the unique, elements of personality profiles is that in some sense you will always have the core personality, but depending on your role, where you're at, you might adapt more. And some, more of your elements might be, kind of seen there. And so, yeah, so it's interesting.
So the question I have about that is how can people so different work well together?
Well, that's the unique. That's the power of the gospel in bringing a diverse body of believers together to form a church. Is that you need everyone. You need the Pauls. You need the Barnabases. You need the John Marks, because they're the lead. They're the leaders in training. And so, sorry for all of those dingings, because I thought I had my do not disturb on, but undoubtedly I don't. So, let me make sure I put it on there. So, anywho, So yeah, I think you need all of them. So
Yeah, I love that answer. It's the power of the gospel because when you interact with somebody that's so differently than you, it's a lot easier to create division, right? We like to be around people that are similar to us, but that's the opportunity and the challenge we have within the body is to see how all of us are complementary and we complement and collaborate, for the glory of Christ. But that doesn't happen automatically.
right.
It doesn't happen automatically. And I think what these personality tests can do is help to illuminate where some friction might be, whether you feel it or not, and then you're just aware of it, right?
Yeah.
So yes, you and I live at different paces of life, and it shows in the personalities, and that can be an asset.
What is an asset? It's how God uses the body. And that's part of where we don't need to look at one personality profile as better than the other.
Right. Yeah.
Because in some sense, your personality is how God has wired you. And so don't be ashamed of how God has wired you. So like one of the things I actually teach in leadership is that if you picture 4 quadrants, okay, so in the upper quadrant you have your IQ, in the lower quadrant you have your personality, and your IQ, your personality, in some sense that's part of who you are. Like what you were born with is what you got.
Yeah.
So I labeled that side. So the top and the bottom of the left-hand side quadrants, I label that who you are. Then on the top right and the bottom right is I label it emotional intelligence, so your EQ, and then your spiritual disciplines. It's basically your faith. And so your EQ and your faith is who you are becoming. So if you look at your spiritual disciplines and your emotional intelligence, what you're doing is that you're utilizing your emotional intelligence and your spiritual disciplines that's forming and forging your faith. You are allowing them to, in some sense, impact and influence your IQ and your personality. Because your personality test, your profiles, like I said, they're not your identity. They're just informative, right? They just help you to identify. And so, but part of the identification of your personality is allowing your personality to be brought under the lordship of Christ, so that your personality, you understand the strengths and the weaknesses, the blind spots, because of sin and our fallen nature. But you're letting Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and the Word and the community of believers do the work to help shape and form your personality, your IQ into who you are becoming for the good of the body and ultimately the glory of God and His mission in the world.
Yeah, amen. So those 4 quadrants, those are IQ and personality. Those are 2 that we're born with and we can't change. And then on the other side, you have EQ and spiritual disciplines. Those are the ones that we can change, and those are the ones, as we think about sanctification, we are in the process of developing and being more formed into the image of Christ.
Yeah. Like for instance, I've been taking the DISC profile test now for like 20 years. I've never scored, I don't even know if S has even popped up on my score. Now I've learned to increase my I, so I'm a high I and a high D.
Right.
But yeah, S, I don't even think it's on the chart. So I have no idea. I have no idea what an S is. So, so that's
Same with me with D. Same with me with D. Like it's never even been a conversation of me being a D at all. Yeah. It's so fun.
But it was funny to read my blind spot with the D is that people would mistake my passion for anger. So
I thought that was a great example of how you practically leave that out and smile more. That was great.
Yeah. Smile more. Yell and smile.
So we have a listener question about this idea of graciously withdrawing. So what can they do? What can we do when a leader is overbearing and actually misuses their authority in the name of developing others? So they misuse their authority in a way that, they're able to say, listen, you know, this is an opportunity for you to get better and to grow and all of that stuff. And they really pitched it as a way of like, we don't really have the opportunity to graciously withdraw. What are some thoughts you might have around a situation that is challenging like that?
Okay, well, let's put it this way. Would John Mark, would he have flourished under Paul at that moment in time?
Not at that point, because he didn't. He already had.
Yeah, he would have thought, and maybe that's why he left. We don't know.
Yeah,
but he would have thought Paul was a jerk. He would have thought Paul was too demanding. He would have thought that Paul abused his leadership. So you have to understand. So that's another thing. He could go both ways. Is that you might have a leader that thinks, or you might have a young person who's needing development, working for a leader that, in some sense, isn't taking the time to invest. Maybe they don't know how. Maybe they don't have the time. We don't know. But they're in authority. So if you can't work for them, and they're not doing anything that is, in some sense, because here's the thing, I want to be very clear. Just because they're ignorant or they might be blindsided by their personality and how they're wired doesn't necessarily mean that they're sinning and leading poorly.
Yeah.
So, because I think that's another thing that we have in our culture. Sure, there are some people that abuse power that are toxic. There are some people, just by the sheer way that they are wired, that they do come across differently, and it hurts people's feelings. Hurting people's feelings is not a sin. Paul hurt some people's feelings. Just could he have learned to be more emotionally intelligent? Possibly. But I think that's where you have to be, very clear. I think you have to be very discerning. Is this a leadership deficiency, or is this the way they're wired? Either way, if they are in authority and you're not flourishing under them, then you have the choice of either staying under them. That's the reason why I said I know I said it at the 11. I don't know if I said it at any other. Is that you need to understand where you are in your developmental journey, because where you are might also impact the kind of leader you need to lead under, or that you need to serve under.
Yeah.
Because if you need to serve more under a Barnabas, well, again, that's going to be on you now. Because you might be crushed under the weight of a Paul ministry. Maybe you need to ask better questions when you're interviewing for a job. Well, hey, how do you develop people? Hey, if I made a mistake, or if I like that, how do you deal with staff members that make a mistake? So I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot that even now. Again, I know I'm putting a little bit of the onus on the subordinate here, but I just don't want I don't want people to think, well, because I work for somebody who is very intense, risk-oriented, and also kind of results-oriented, that, well, there's something's wrong with them. No, you need to understand how they're wired, how you're wired. Now, again, the onus is going to also be on the leader, that you need to understand how you're wired, and you need to make sure that you don't bring anybody on your team that you're going to crush.
Yeah.
Because I do think we're living in a day and age now that, the average age of a senior pastor is 56. The average age of a senior pastor is 56. We're getting older. And I think one of the reasons why we're getting older is because the church has crushed younger leaders. We have not developed them well. They are not given opportunities. There's a lot of layers there, I actually believe, but I think that's actually part of it. We have not developed John Marks for whatever reason. And so I do think it's an issue, but to answer that question, it's a great question, but I think the onus is really on both of them, which is part of the reason why you need to understand how you're wired, so that you can understand who you can flourish under and who can flourish under you. Because that's actually the essence of organizational leadership is the organization flourishing. And the only way that an organization is going to flourish is if people are in the right place, in the right position under the right leader and with the right leader.
Yeah.
So there's an alignment. And what we're seeing with Paul and Barnabas is that there was a misalignment, and they needed, in some sense, to split so that there could be an alignment.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
What I like about that question is just the there's a lot of nuance there, but just this idea of trying to wrestle through a real life, situation.
Yeah. And this real life situation, I want you to understand, like, so why do sometimes staff members get fired? Why are some staff members let go? They didn't do their job. Now, sometimes they're done, the way they are let go is poor because they didn't know, because there was no accountability. There was no at least attempt to develop, and that's on the church or that's on the leader. But if there is, clear expectations and there was often accountability, and the person on staff who was serving could never hit the expectations, would never see any kind of incremental development, then sure, they're going to be rightfully let go. They're going to be rightfully terminated. Because maybe here's the thing, it's not a good fit here, but that doesn't mean that it won't be a good fit there, wherever there is. So I want to be even clear, because I think there probably, especially if anybody who has been in church any amount of time, maybe a staff member that they really loved was there, and they got fired. And again, here's what I would say is that probably a lot of church firings are not healthy, because ultimately those in charge, those in authority, aren't healthy leaders in and of themselves. But I still believe in that principle, is that if you don't humbly submit, graciously withdraw, if you continue to do whatever you want to do, however you want to do it, whenever you want to do it, and you're not listening to those who are in authority over you, you really do have the in some sense the right to be rightfully fired.
So that leads us to that next point, and we've got two questions under this life lesson section before we wrap up. So, and these were, this whole section was the authentic, vulnerable message. So, the first one is, your ministry. You laid out your ministry for us. This became a very personal message for you. So, just talk about the vulnerability that you shared and why you felt that was appropriate or helpful for this message in terms of, the rocky start in your ministry.
Yeah. Well, I felt like it was the perfect message to share because it fit. Like, I don't want to necessarily ever force anything to fit, but I'm like, oh my gosh, like this, with John Mark, like, yeah. And I've because I teach leadership, there's a book called The Making of the Leader by Robert Clinton, where he talks about the 5 stages of a leader's journey. And the third stage is a maturing ministry, where you're learning really who you are, and you're really kind of learning through a lot of hurt and failure a lot of times. And then you get to your convergent stage. And so really the first 20 years of ministry for me was that ministry maturing. I wish I was at places that allowed me to mature rather than, I wouldn't use my deficiencies in a way to give me the raw end of the deal, but that was the journey that God had me on. And so for me, like I do believe in my own leadership that one of the best ways to lead is through authenticity and vulnerability, to tell people like, listen, you might look at me now and go, wow, he's got it all together. Yeah, I still don't have it all together, but I have it more together because Jesus is putting it more together for me. So that's why I want to share my story. Like I was telling one person today, they were actually emailing me, and I just said, don't be ashamed of your story. Own your story. And so for me, I'm not ashamed of my story. I'm going to own my story. I'm not going to parade my story around going, look how great my story is. Because I don't know if it's, I mean, sure, there's parts where I'm not necessarily proud of it, but it's my story. It's the story that God gave me, but it's also the story that he's writing. And so to know that he's the author of my story, he's sovereign over my story. So therefore, I'm not going to be ashamed of my story. And so I'm going to own it. People may not like my story. People might want to, dig into, well, what did you, I didn't do anything that would disqualify myself from ministry. It was, again, it was deficiencies of leadership, coupled by really very unhealthy, sometimes toxic churches. And, but I got to learn, which is why I needed to digest. See, I never had leaders to, on site help me develop. Like, hey, when you do this, here's what happens. You might want it So what I had to do is I had to use those disappointments for my own development. So instead of getting bitter, I had to get better. And that's a huge point, because those disappointments, if you're not careful, those disappointments can lead to bitterness, and you can become more bitter in life and in your leadership rather than better in life and in your leadership. So, those, all of those lessons that I wrote down, that's me personally having to wrestle through some of the major lessons that I learned. Well, I'll give you a funny little story. So I gave the title to one of my lessons, "Don't marry an ugly woman hoping that or don't marry an ugly girl hoping that you can make her beautiful." So Ellie looked over to Joni and said, "Is he talking about you?" So I'm like, well, I hope no one else thought that, because I'm talking about ministry. So Let me just unpack that one, what I actually meant, just for Ellie's sake and anybody else who was thinking that. No, I think my wife is beautiful. I would have married her if I didn't think she was beautiful and I was attracted to her. But what was happening is that because I'm wired the way I am, and I'm a visionary, I can see where something is, but I can also see where something can be. So I was looking at these churches that I was interviewing with going, I would never come here in its current state. I wouldn't even be a member at this church in her current state.
Yeah.
When I would go there, I would go there out of sheer vision of seeing what she could be. So I would marry an ugly girl, aka church, knowing that I could go to work making her beautiful.
Yeah.
But what I had learned was that's not fair to her. I need to love her the way she is, and I need to be proud of her the way she is.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a lesson that I actually had to learn. And so Northland, that was a lesson. I would go, even though Northland had been through so much transition, I could go there and be a member at Northland on day one without feeling like I had to change her. Now, did changes need to happen? Yeah, absolutely. But I could love her the way she was. And if nothing ever changed, I could be there. And see, and other places that I had gone, I didn't go there like that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, well said.
So Ellie, that's what I meant. Your mom is beautiful. So
yeah, I understood it that way. I knew you were talking about churches.
Well, I mean, and I think most people did.
Yeah.
With 15-year-old, she's
she's protecting her mama.
Yeah.
Okay. So last question. Yeah. You talk about the rocks in your life, and this was obviously another point where you got emotional and vulnerable. I think you got emotional every time you talked about it. So
I did. I didn't know if I would. Because in some sense, you can't conjure up emotions, No,
that's not authentic. But yours obviously was. So what advice do you have for developing and cultivating rocks in our lives? Because I really think that point resonated with many of us. And I think a natural question to that is, for some it's I know who I need to, but others might be just man, how do I do that? I want to be there. So what advice might you have?
Oh gosh, man, that's a good question. I do think Barnabases are few and far between. Uh, sure, there might be people who are wired to be an encouragement, but we do live in a pretty selfish society. So even if you're wired to be an encouragement, you're tending, you don't tend to necessarily use it the way Barnabas did. So if you can find a Barnabas in your life, don't let go. Like, that's what I mean. Like, that's what I meant by latch onto it. So like, I text Ed often. I text Kevin often. That's why I bring them to Northland, because these are Barnabases in my life. This is why I pointed Joni out, because I very seldom, but this was a good point, or good way for me, and it was just the perfect opportunity to identify her and thank you in front of people, because you want to latch on to them. So if you can find somebody who believes in you, nurture that.
Yeah.
Northland, I hope and pray that ultimately we would be a Barnabas. Like I want, I didn't say this, but I actually thought about it, is Northland did play the role of a Barnabas in my life to a degree, right? Because, you were on the search team. So you remember the first interview we had. It's like, I basically was telling you why you don't need me, or why you don't want me.
I'm talking about all the tracks on your resume.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just going to, the fact that y'all saw past that, the fact that you all saw that there's some substance to this candidate at the time. Let's continue to dig into it. The fact that then when it was passed to the governing elders, same thing, with them, so I hope and pray that we can cultivate the spirit of Barnabas at Northland. That yes, I'm an Apostle Paul kind of leader in that regard, but we need to make sure that we have a lot of Barnabases, to invest and to develop and to see the best in people, to give them a second, a third, a fourth chance. So I hope and pray that we can become a church for the John Marks of the world. And so I hope we can be that, that kind of people that people will find their Barnabases and latch on to them. So I hope and pray that we can be that. But my encouragement would just be aware of who might be in your life. And then if you find somebody like that and you want to ask them specifically, will you mentor me? Will you invest in me? That's what I did with Ed. I said, I need you to invest in me. And then Kevin, kind of same thing. So I've in some sense, I officially asked, and now we've kind of, in some sense, passed the more formal, kind of investment. Now it's more of the relational investment. But it's like I told Ed, I texted him and I said, I want you to know that you play, because I was texting him about this message and I was telling him, I need a picture of you and me next time. But I just said, let me just take this opportunity to thank you again. Because if you can ever identify yourself as a John Mark and you can identify a Barnabas in your life, you need to be very, very grateful for them. And you need to let them know. And you don't need to take them for granted. So that's how I would just encourage people. The God's probably placed some people around you that you look up to, that you see make you better. And if you have that person or people, you need to let them know, and maybe even kind of formally ask them, hey, will you invest in me around X? Maybe it's parenting. You need help, developing as a parent, but you see somebody you aspire to be. Maybe it's in business. You see another business leader, and you're like, man, you inspire me. You make me better. Will you invest in me? Maybe it's in ministry. And so maybe it's in just life. Like, this person just inspires you to be a better person, and they have influence. Maybe you just want to ask them. So that's a way that you can, in some sense, be aware of who God has placed around you and just formally ask. And by you asking, that's actually you encouraging that Barnabas that can potentially be in your life. Say, I see something in you that you make me better.
Well said. Yeah, well said. What I heard from that was the intentionality of the maintaining the relationship, but also how helpful it is to make it, that formal ask and having a formal set time. And as that progresses, a lot of times I've experienced that too. A lot of times that goes to a more informal relational thing, but then the latching on, maintaining, holding on to that person. And I think that's such a great point that you asking them actually encourages them as well, because I've experienced that as well. So yeah. I think that's a great place for us to end for today.
Amen. Well, thanks again, Matt, for how you lead and the questions and the framework that you put together every single week. You truly are an element of a Barnabas, and so grateful for you, man. And so, Northland family and friends, thank you once again for tuning in to another episode of Extra Takes. We love you. Grateful to God for you. Blessings.
Thanks for listening to Extra Takes. Be sure to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts so you won't miss a single episode.